The mist clings low to the ground, veiling the rice paddies in a hush of silver silence. Somewhere beyond the trees, a bamboo flute cries out, a long, hollow note that vanishes into the morning fog. This is Feudal Japan, a land where every moment is ruled by ritual, where honor is heavier than steel, and where the wrong glance, the wrong word, could cost your life. But behind the legends of noble samurai and towering castles lies another story, a quieter one, of calloused hands, of cracked wooden bowls, of families who bent beneath the weight of invisible codes. Could you survive a day in this world of unspoken rules and silent eyes? Let us know in the comments. Would you find calm in the order, or be crushed by the weight of it all? And let us know where you're listening from, and whether the night is just beginning for you or already deep. Now, dim the screen. Let the night close in. The sandals were made of straw, but they dug into the soles as if carved from stone. Each thread was rough against the skin, fraying already at the edges, and though they were bound tightly with twisted fibers, the earth beneath them was unyielding. Dawn had not yet warmed the fields, and the soil was still hard with the memory of night's chill. Every step carried not only the weight of the body, but the weight of the world in which that body belonged. The mist hovered low, veiling the narrow path that wound through the rice paddies. It clung to the ankles, cool and damp, and every breath drawn into the chest carried the faint scent of wet earth. From the east came the distant call of a crow, sharp against the stillness, followed by the softer sound of water trickling through irrigation channels, carved by hand long ago. This was the rhythm of morning in feudal Japan. No alarm clocks, no lanterns blazing in every home, no chatter spilling from crowded streets. Instead, it was the quiet beat of footsteps on a dirt path, the faint rustle of clothing woven from hemp and cotton, the murmur of a world awakening under unseen laws. For though the village seemed hushed, it was watched, always watched. In the distance, the first shapes stirred. A farmer bent low to check the dikes around his paddies, ensuring that no water had slipped away in the night. Another hauled a bucket from the well, its wooden frame groaning with the familiar strain. A woman crouched in front of her hut, striking flint against steel to coax a spark into the waiting tinder. There was no wasted motion, no lingering pause. Every gesture was practiced, born from years of necessity. And here, in this life, survival was not a matter of strength alone. It was a matter of knowing the rules. Rules that were not written on parchment or nailed to the walls of shrines, but rules that hovered in the very air, unspoken yet unbreakable. A peasant bowed when a samurai passed, never raising the eyes. A family surrendered grain when the tax collector arrived, even if it meant an empty belly. Children were silent when elders spoke, their laughter softened, tucked away for the private corners of day. Could you live by such silence? Could your every instinct bend beneath the weight of invisible codes? The sandals pressed onward. Behind each step came a small puff of dust where the dirt grew dry, and in the moist places the straw darkened, soaking in water like a thirsty reed. The wearer of these sandals, a boy no more than 12, walked with his head slightly bowed, though the road ahead was empty. Habit made him walk so, not fear. He carried a bundle across his back, wrapped in faded cloth, its shape uneven, a mix of tools and the day's first offering, a handful of rice, carefully tied. The boy's name was Kenji. His family's hut crouched at the edge of the village, where the fields met the whisper of the forest. It was a dwelling no larger than a stable, with paper-thin walls patched in places with bark and cloth, its roof sagging with the weight of last year's storms. Yet to Kenji, it was home. The hearth inside glowed faintly even now, where his mother tended embers as she had every morning for years. He had left her kneeling by it, hands folded in her lap for a moment of silent prayer before she stirred the pot that would stretch yesterday's rice into today's porridge. Kenji's father was already in the fields. His figure would be bent low, straw hat pulled over his brow, sleeves tied back with strips of cloth. He was a man of few words, hardened by sun and hunger alike. Kenji adored him, though he rarely said so. Words of affection were luxuries his family could not afford, not because they lacked love, but because they lived in a world where each breath was meant for work. The village itself was no more than 50 souls, clustered along a single narrow road. The huts leaned inward, their wooden frames blackened by age, their roofs patched with layers of thatch. Here and there, a small shrine stood at the roadside, no taller than a man's chest, marked with ribbons and pebbles left by passing hands. Beside one, a lone pine tree bent eastward, shaped by years of wind. A child's laughter drifted from somewhere behind a hut, quickly hushed by a mother's voice. As Kenji walked, the village revealed itself not in grandeur, but in details. The way a door creaked open, the smell of millet boiling in a pot, the faint scratch of a broom sweeping dust into a pile. These sounds were the heartbeat of his world. Yet even here, under the quiet sky, the shadow of power pressed down. High above, beyond the village, stood the faint outline of a castle keep. Its white walls caught the light of morning, turning pale gold as the sun rose higher. To Kenji, it seemed impossibly distant, both in height and in meaning. For those walls belonged to men who lived by a different set of rules, the samurai and their lords, whose lives were measured not by back-breaking labor, but by honor and command. The villagers did not speak of the castle unless they had to. Its presence was both a shield and a weight, protection from bandits, yet also the source of endless taxes and sudden summons. At any moment, a rider could thunder down the road demanding grain, labor, or silence, and no one refused. No one ever refused. Kenji had never seen the Lord himself, only the glint of armored men on horseback as they passed, their banners snapping in the wind. When they appeared, the village stilled. Children ducked behind doors. Women lowered their eyes. Men bowed low, waiting for the thunder of hooves to fade. It was not fear of death alone. It was the knowledge that life itself was bound by these unseen reins. And so the boy walked on, sandals biting, bundle heavy, yet shoulders steady. He was learning what all in his village learned, that survival was not about endurance alone. It was about walking carefully through a world where every gesture mattered. Ahead, the road curved toward the fields where he would join his father. The mist was lifting now, peeled away by the warmth of day. Birds stirred in the trees, their wings scattering droplets of dew. Somewhere, a bell rang, a deep, resonant tone that rolled down from the castle on the hill. It marked the hour, not for villagers, but for samurai and monks. Yet even here, the peasants listened. Time was not their own. Kenji paused for just a moment, shifting the bundle on his back. The straw straps pressed into his skin, leaving faint red lines. Yet he did not complain. He simply breathed, long and quiet, as the sound of the bell lingered in the air. Can you imagine it? Waking each morning to such a rhythm, not to your own desire, but to the tolling of a distant bell, to the hunger of the fields, to the silence of rules that could not be spoken aloud. The day had only just begun, and already the weight of the sandals was heavy. The sun had climbed a little higher by the time Kenji reached the fields. The mist, once heavy on the ground, was now dissolving into threads of vapour that lifted into the sky. What remained was the faint shimmer of dew upon the rice stalks, each droplet catching the light as though the earth itself was stitched with silver beads. The paddies stretched outward in careful square plots, each bound by narrow ridges of earth that held the water in place. From above, it might have looked like a patchwork quilt, each square alive with reflection and quiet purpose. Kenji slipped from the path onto the edge of one such ridge, his sandals squelching softly in the wet earth. His father was already there, bent low, sleeves rolled past his elbows, straw hat shading his face. With each motion he pulled at the weeds that had crept up overnight, tossing them into the water where they would float and wither. He did not look up as Kenji approached. He only said in a voice low and steady, "You're late." Kenji bowed his head, setting the bundle down beside him. "The well was crowded," he answered. There was no reply. In silence, Kenji slipped off his sandals and waded into the paddy. The water rose cool around his ankles, carrying the scent of mud and growing life. His toes sank into the silt, and for a moment he wobbled, but he steadied himself by watching his father's stance. Wide, low, purposeful. Every gesture of the man seemed carved by repetition, honed by necessity. The work of tending rice was not quick. It was a ritual that consumed the body and mind alike. From the earliest planting, when seedlings were pressed gently into the flooded fields, to this daily tending, when weeds were pulled and water levels checked, each moment mattered. One mistake, a broken dike, a missed pest, a season of poor rain, could unravel the work of an entire year. Kenji bent low, his fingers finding the small, sharp leaves of a weed. He tugged it free, careful not to disturb the tender rice shoots beside it. The rhythm was slow, patient. Pull, toss, step, pull, toss, step. The field whispered around him, the rustle of water, the faint buzz of insects, the sigh of wind through distant trees. In the distance, other families worked their plots. From one corner came the sound of a woman singing softly to herself, her voice a thread of melody floating over the paddies. A child splashed nearby, scolded gently by a grandfather whose laughter betrayed more amusement than anger. Yet beneath these simple sounds lay the same truth. The rice ruled them all. Rice was more than food in this world. It was life itself, measured not only in bowls on the hearth, but in taxes demanded, in status bestowed. The village's tribute to the Lord was calculated in rice, not coin. Wealth was counted not in gold, but in the harvest stored in tightly bound sacks. A bad yield meant hunger, but worse, it meant vulnerability. For if the Lord's collectors found the village lacking, punishment was swift. Men could be conscripted, women forced to labour. In rare, terrible cases, entire families displaced. Kenji had heard these stories whispered at night, when his parents thought he slept. They were not told as warnings, but as quiet truths, like the sound of the wind or the call of the crow. "Work hard," his mother would murmur when she tucked him into his thin bedding. "Work hard, and the rice will protect us." Yet even as she said it, he knew there was more to it than effort, for the rice listened only to the rain. Rain was the true master here. Too little, and the paddies cracked into thirsty scars, their shoots withering in the sun. Too much, and floods swept through, drowning the fields, breaking the dikes. carrying months of labor away in a single night. The villagers could plant, weed, and guard. But in the end, they bent beneath the will of the sky. Kenji's father knew this well. He often paused to look at the clouds, reading their shapes like a scroll. Thin clouds bring rest, he once told Kenji. Heavy ones bring hunger. And though the boy did not fully understand, he watched too, learning to see in the sky the fortunes of his family. That morning, the clouds were light and scattered, touched with the pale blue of late spring. The air smelled damp, but not heavy. Perhaps the rice would be kind this year. Perhaps. Kenji worked until his back ached, his fingers raw with tiny cuts from the stubborn weeds. Sweat trickled down his brow, stinging his eyes, but he did not complain. To complain was to dishonor the work. Instead, he straightened only when his father did, following him back to the ridge where their tools lay. There, his father crouched, opening the bundle Kenji had carried. From within, he drew a small cloth tied into a knot. He loosened it, revealing a ball of rice, packed tightly, flecked with bits of pickled plum. The sight of it made Kenji's stomach clench with hunger. His father broke the ball in half and handed one piece to the boy. They ate in silence, sitting on the ridge, their legs dangling into the paddy. The rice was cold, the plum tart, but to Kenji, it was the richest taste in the world. Each grain carried the labor of months, the planting, the watering, the tending, the prayers. He chewed slowly, savoring each bite. Above them, the sun grew hotter, pressing its weight onto their backs. Dragonflies skimmed the water, their wings flashing iridescent in the light. Somewhere, a frog croaked. The world seemed still, yet alive, bound by the slow pulse of the season. It was in these moments that Kenji sometimes wondered, was this all life would be? Wading in the fields, bending low, chasing weeds from water, praying for rain. He did not mind the work. It was the sameness that pressed on him, as steady and heavy as the sandals at his feet. But then, his father's voice broke the silence. "Do you see?" he asked, gesturing toward the rice shoots swaying gently in the water. "They look fragile, but they endure. Each day we tend them. They grow stronger. So do we." Kenji nodded, though he was not sure he fully believed it. Still, the words sank into him, as all his father's words did, carried in silence more than sound. By midday, the village bell rang again, this time struck by a monk from the small temple near the hill. Its sound was softer than the castle bell, rounder, more human. It called not to samurai, but to peasants, reminding them of the hour, of prayer, of the cycle of day. Kenji's father stood, brushing mud from his hands. "Come," he said simply, and together they walked back toward the road. The sandals, now wet from the paddy, squelched with every step. They were heavy with water, yet Kenji bore them without thought. The boy had learned already what every villager knew. In this world, even discomfort was a kind of duty. As they walked, Kenji glanced once more at the sky. The clouds still drifted thin and pale, but in the far distance, a darker mass gathered on the horizon. A storm, perhaps, or only a shadow. And so the rhythm of life continued. Rice, rain, and rules older than memory itself. Could you endure it? To know that your every meal, your every breath, rested not in your own hands, but in the hands of the sky above you. To bow each morning to the soil, each night to the silence, never certain what tomorrow's clouds would bring. The sandals pressed onward, carrying boy and father alike back toward the village. Behind them, the rice swayed gently in its watery cradle, listening as it always did. for the footsteps of rain. The light had grown softer by the time Kenji and his father returned to their dwelling. The sun hung lower now, its brightness filtered through the veil of drifting clouds. The air carried a faint smell of smoke, drifting lazily across the village from hearths where women bent over pots. Each home gave off its own muted trail, rising through the thatch like fragile threads pulled toward the heavens. Their hut crouched near the edge of the village, where the last line of paddies gave way to a border of scrub grass and trees. From a distance, it looked like little more than a shadow on the earth. A roof of layered reeds sloping low, its walls patched and uneven. The wood that framed it was dark, nearly black from years of weather, and the paper that lined its sliding door bore stains of smoke, patched in places with cloth. To anyone else, it might have seemed barely a shelter. To Kenji, it was the center of the world. He ducked through the low entrance after his father, careful to remove his sandals before stepping onto the raised floor of packed earth and worn planks. The air inside was warmer than outside, filled with the faint, comforting aroma of rice porridge and simmered vegetables. Smoke clung faintly to the rafters, curling upward from the small hearth that glowed in the center of the single main room. His mother knelt beside it, her sleeves tied back neatly, her hair bound with a strip of cloth. She turned her head just enough to acknowledge their arrival, her lips pressing into the faintest smile before she returned to stirring the pot. "Wash," his father said simply, lowering himself onto the floor. His voice carried the weight of command, but not unkindness. Kenji obeyed, crouching by the water jar near the door, dipping his hands and rubbing away the mud that clung stubbornly to his skin. The coolness refreshed him, though it also reminded him of the weariness in his muscles. When he joined his father near the hearth, his mother placed 3 bowls on the floor. The porridge inside was thin, more water than rice, but flecked with bits of daikon and a few leaves of greens. To Kenji, hungry from the fields, it looked like a feast. He bowed his head, waiting for his father to lift his bowl first, then followed suit. The first sip was hot, the steam rising to sting his nose. The broth carried the earthy flavor of roots, the faint sweetness of grain stretched thin but lovingly prepared. He ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, though his stomach urged him to rush. The hut was quiet but not silent. The crackle of the fire filled the air, joined by the occasional shift of wood settling in the walls. Beyond, faint sounds drifted from the village, the call of a child, the bark of a dog, the low hum of distant voices. But here, within these paper-thin walls, the world seemed smaller, gentler, wrapped in the fragile cocoon of family. After the bowls were emptied and carefully set aside, the evening rhythm began. His mother folded strips of cloth she had been mending by the fire. His father sharpened the blade of a sickle, the steady scrape of stone against metal, rhythmic and slow. Kenji settled near the hearth, tracing shapes in the ash with a finger, listening to the sounds of his parents at work. It was in these moments that the whispers came, not secrets of rebellion or daring, but the small, hushed exchanges that bound a family together. "Tomorrow, the western dike must be reinforced," his father murmured, eyes fixed on the gleam of the blade. "I will send Kenji with you," his mother replied softly, never pausing in her folding. "The rain may come sooner than we thought." Their words were practical, but beneath them lay a thread of care. They spoke of work, yet their voices carried an undercurrent of worry for the boy who sat listening, his eyes wide though he pretended to study the ash. When they thought he was not listening, they spoke differently still. "The child grows thin," his mother whispered one night. "So do we all," his father answered, his voice steady but his sigh betraying the weight he carried. Kenji often pretended not to hear, but the words sank into him nonetheless. He carried them with him into the fields, into his dreams, into the quiet spaces of his heart. Sometimes, when the work was lighter and the night was kind, his mother told stories as she mended by the fire. Her voice softened then, weaving tales of fox spirits who tricked travelers, of gods who walked the mountains, of heroes who rose from humble beginnings to earn honor and respect. Kenji loved these stories most, though he rarely asked for them. He knew they were gifts, offered sparingly, like extra grains hidden at the bottom of a pot. "Can you imagine it, Kenji?" she asked once, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "A fox that could change its shape, walking as a man among us." Kenji had smiled shyly, nodding, though a part of him wondered if such stories were warnings as much as entertainments. For in a world where appearances carried such weight, even a fox spirit was bound by rules of disguise and obedience. On harsher nights, when the wind rattled the roof and the rain beat down, the whispers turned toward prayer. His mother would kneel before the small household shrine, her hands pressed together, her lips moving silently. Kenji sometimes joined her, though he did not always know the words. His father rarely did, preferring to sit in silence by the fire, his eyes fixed on flames that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Kenji learned then that strength was not always loud, not always seen. Sometimes it was the quiet endurance of a mother stitching by firelight, the steady hand of a father sharpening a blade for tomorrow's labor. Sometimes it was the whispers that kept a family together beneath the thin veil of thatch and paper. And though the world outside demanded obedience, demanded silence, demanded unyielding work, within these walls, Kenji felt something different. A fragile space where love existed not in declarations, but in the way his mother saved the softest piece of root for his bowl, or the way his father adjusted the roof by hand to keep the rain from dripping on his bedding. Would you notice such things if you lived here? Could you find comfort in whispers so small, in gestures so fleeting, that they might be missed entirely if you were not watching closely? The night deepened. The fire burned lower, its glow softening against the walls. Kenji's eyelids grew heavy, his body aching from the day's labor. He lay down on his bedding of straw and cloth, pulling the thin blanket over himself. The sounds of his parents' work drifted around him, steady and familiar. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. The roof creaked, the walls shuddered gently. Yet within, the whispers continued, soft, steady, unbroken. And so Kenji drifted towards sleep, wrapped in the fragile safety of a thatched roof, in the unspoken love of voices, hushed but never silent. The morning after the whispers had faded into sleep, Kenji rose before the sun. His body ached from the day before, yet his feet found the path with the same steady rhythm. The sandals, still damp from the paddies, clung stubbornly to his heels as he walked. His father had gone ahead, leaving him to carry the bundle of tools. The air was sharp and cool, filled with the scent of pine from the nearby woods. The road through the village was quiet at this hour. Only the faint creak of a cart's wheels and the low murmur of women at the well stirred the silence. Dogs prowled the edges of huts, noses low to the ground, tails flicking. Kenji kept his gaze lowered, careful with each step, for even on an empty road, one never knew who might appear. And then, as if summoned from the very earth itself, the rhythm of hoofbeats began. At first they were distant, little more than a dull thud against the morning stillness, but they grew louder, sharper, the ground trembling faintly with each strike. Heads lifted from their work. A woman at the well froze, her hand stilling on the rope. Children vanished behind doorways. The very air seemed to draw tight, holding its breath. Kenji stopped too, his bundles suddenly heavy in his arms. Dust stirred on the road ahead, rising in small clouds that curled in the wind. From within that haze, figures emerged, dark, towering shapes astride powerful horses. Samurai. Their armor caught the pale light, lacquered plates gleaming faintly in shades of black and crimson. Sashes of silk fluttered at their waists, and the hilts of their swords shone where the sun caught polished metal. Each man sat tall in the saddle, faces calm, eyes sharp, their presence filling the narrow road as though they owned not only the path, but the very breath of those who stood upon it. And in truth they did. Kenji's father had once told him, "When they ride through, you bow. You do not speak. You do not meet their eyes. To forget this is to invite ruin." So Kenji bowed. He lowered himself until his forehead nearly touched the bundle he carried. The straw straps cut into his shoulders, but he dared not shift. Around him, the village had fallen into silence. The only sound was the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the faint jingle of metal fittings as the samurai advanced. One horse drew closer, its shadow falling across Kenji's bent form. He could hear the beast's breath, hot and steady, smell the mix of sweat and leather. A moment passed, long, heavy, endless. He felt the gaze of its rider upon him, though he dared not lift his head. And then, just as suddenly, the shadow passed. The hoofbeats continued, fading slowly down the road. Only when the last echo vanished did the village breathe again. Women returned to their work, though their movements were more cautious now. A door creaked open, then shut quickly. Even the dogs seemed subdued, tails lowered, ears pressed back. Kenji straightened slowly, his arms trembling from holding the bundle so still. His heart beat fast, though he had done nothing but bow. He glanced toward the retreating figures. Their banners fluttered in the distance, symbols of their clan, colors bold against the sky. He knew none of their names, none of their lives, and yet their presence dictated his own. His father appeared from a side path, his face unreadable. "Come," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The fields won't wait." As they walked together, Kenji risked a question. Where were they going? His father did not look at him. Wherever they choose, the answer was enough. For in this world, a samurai's path was not to be questioned. Yet Kenji could not stop his thoughts from wandering. What would it be, he wondered, to sit astride such a horse, to wear lacquered armor, to carry a sword that gleamed in the sun? Did those men feel the same weight in their sandals that he did? Or did the world bend more easily beneath their feet? He remembered stories whispered in the village, of samurai who defended their lords with unswerving loyalty, who lived and died by the code of Bushido. But he had also heard other stories, told more carefully, in hushed tones when the night was deep. Stories of peasants cut down for failing to bow quickly enough, of entire villages punished for mistakes not their own. Which story was true? Perhaps both. Perhaps that was the nature of power. As the morning wore on, the samurai disappeared from sight, leaving only the faint track of hooves pressed into the dust. Yet their shadow lingered in the village long after, shaping every motion, every word. For it was not only rice and rain that ruled here, but the unseen weight of eyes that could look down at any moment. Kenji's father returned to his work without another word. Kenji followed, yet the image of those riders stayed with him. The gleam of armor, the sound of hooves, the stillness they brought with them. Would you have lifted your eyes if you were there? Would curiosity have overcome caution? Or would you too have bowed low, the dust of the road clinging to your skin, the sound of hooves echoing long after they had passed? The sandals pressed forward once more, the bundle steady on Kenji's back. But in his heart, the question lingered. What shadow did the samurai truly cast? And how long could a boy walk beneath it without wondering who he might become? By the time the sun leaned high overhead, the air grew heavy. The clouds that had gathered in the east the day before now drifted closer, shading the paddies in slow-moving shadows. The rhythm of the fields continued. Weed pulled, seedlings straightened, water checked. But the villagers' movements carried an unease, as though they all felt some invisible presence approaching. Kenji sensed it too, though he did not yet know why. His father's brow was furrowed deeper than usual, his gaze straying often toward the road. Other men worked more quietly, glancing now and then at their huts as if bracing for something. The women at the well whispered with lowered heads. Even the children, usually quick to laughter when chores were done, stayed close to doorways, their voices hushed. And then, as the day tipped toward afternoon, he came. The tax collector. He did not ride a horse, nor wear the gleaming armor of a samurai. His robe was plain, though of finer weave than any villager could afford. Its fabric brushed clean despite the dust of the road. His sandals were thick and well made, each step firm, unhurried. At his side walked two attendants, both carrying ledgers and small wooden boxes bound with cord. Behind them trudged a boy somewhat older than Kenji, a servant with sharp eyes, and a bundle of empty sacks slung across his back. The village stilled at his arrival, tools lowered, voices silenced. Men straightened their backs, bowing low, while women bent their knees beside baskets of grain or jars of water. Even dogs crept back, tails tucked, as though they too understood the presence of authority. Kenji stood frozen on the ridge of the paddy, the water lapping quietly at his ankles. He felt his father's hand on his shoulder, firm, steady, guiding him downward into a bow. Together they bent low, foreheads nearly touching the earth. The tax collector did not bow. He never would. His gaze moved over the villagers as one might look at trees or stones, objects to be counted, measured, harvested. His attendants unrolled their ledgers, dipping brushes into ink with quick, practiced motions. Names were called. Families stepped forward, each bringing sacks of rice or bundles of millet, offerings carried in silence. The servant boy took them, weighing with his eyes before passing them to the attendants. Marks were made in the ledger. The tax collector nodded faintly, his face impassive, already looking to the next. When Kenji's family name was called, his father lifted the sack he had prepared. Grain saved carefully over weeks, held back from their own bowls so the offering would not fall short. He carried it forward, setting it gently before the collector. The man did not thank him. He simply glanced at the sack, his eyes narrowing slightly. He lifted one corner, testing its weight, then released it with a faint grunt. His attendant made a mark in the ledger. For a heartbeat, Kenji thought it was done. But then the collector's gaze shifted, slowly, deliberately, toward him. Kenji lowered his eyes at once, bowing deeper. He could feel the man's gaze upon him, heavy as the sun. For reasons he could not name, his chest tightened, his breath shallow. At last, the gaze passed. The collector turned, moving on to the next family. Kenji straightened, his face hot, though he had not moved. His father retrieved the empty sack and walked back in silence. The weight of his steps seemed heavier than before. The ritual continued, one family after another, until the collector's boxes were filled. The servant hefted the burden onto his back, his steps wobbling slightly under the weight. The attendants closed their ledgers with neat efficiency. And then, as quietly as he had come, the collector left. His sandals pressed a new line of prints into the dust, his figure growing smaller as he returned toward the road. Only when he was gone did the village exhale. Shoulders slumped, voices returned in low murmurs. A woman wiped her brow, though no sweat clung there. A man let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since morning. Kenji looked at his father. The man's face was unreadable, his mouth set in a hard line. But his hands, calloused, strong, tightened around the sack he carried, knuckles white against the coarse fabric. That evening, the hut was quieter than usual. The porridge was thinner, stretched further now that the tribute had been taken. Kenji's mother stirred it slowly, her eyes fixed on the pot, though her thoughts seemed far away. His father ate in silence, his jaw tight. Kenji wanted to ask, why does he never bow? Why do we give what we need more than he? But the questions pressed against his lips and went no further. He knew the answer already. In this world, the tax collector never bowed because bowing meant humility, and humility belonged only to those beneath. He never bowed because his power came not from strength of arms, like the samurai, but from the silent weight of the ledger, from the knowledge that hunger could be dealt with a single stroke of ink. The villagers bowed because to do otherwise was to risk not only their own lives, but their children's, their neighbors', their entire way of existence. To bow was not weakness, it was survival. Kenji finished his bowl, the thin broth settling uneasily in his stomach. He lay down on his bedding that night with the faint sound of his mother's whispering prayers in his ears. Through the thin roof, he could hear the sigh of the wind, and far off, the first patter of rain on the fields. Would you endure it? To surrender the food you had labored for, knowing it meant your children might hunger tomorrow? To bow before a man who never lowered his own eyes, never bent his back, yet held the power to decide whether your family endured or withered? The Sandals waited by the door, damp from the fields, ready to bear their weight again come morning. But tonight, their burden seemed heavier than ever, not from mud or rain, but from the silence of obedience. The rain that had begun as a faint patter grew into a steady rhythm through the afternoon. It was not the violent storm that villagers feared, but a gentle, soaking rain, the kind that darkened the soil and filled the dikes without breaking their banks. Drops slid from the eaves of huts in thin rivulets, gathering into muddy pools along the road. The fields drank deeply, their watery mirrors rippling with every splash. Kenji worked beside his father until the light began to fade, their figures bent low beneath the mist of rain. By the time they set down their tools, his shoulders burned, and his palms were raw from gripping wet weeds. Still, there was a quiet relief in seeing the paddies full. their shoots standing taller beneath the nourishment of the sky. As they walked back toward the village, the first deep toll of the temple bell rolled across the fields. Dong! The sound was slow and resonant, vibrating in the air like a living thing. It seemed to sink into the soil, to echo in the ribs of those who heard it. Each strike was followed by a long silence, as though the world itself paused to listen before the next. Dong! Kenji lifted his head toward the hill where the temple stood, half hidden among pines. He could not see the bell from here, but he imagined the monk's hands pulling the thick rope, guiding the heavy bronze to strike with measured force. He had stood at the temple once, watching from a respectful distance as the bell was sounded. Its surface was green with age, carved with patterns of lotus petals and clouds. To touch it was forbidden, yet even from afar, Kenji felt its presence as something greater than stone or metal, a heartbeat of time itself. Dong. The bell marked the approach of evening prayers, the time when monks folded their hands, when samurai paused to reflect, when villagers bent towards their hearths. It was a sound that belonged to everyone and no one, a reminder that life was measured not by the rising sun alone, but by the tolling of order. As the bell continued, Kenji's father stopped walking. He bowed his head briefly, his lips unmoving, but his stillness itself a prayer. Kenji imitated him, lowering his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. The rain cooled his skin, but the resonance of the bell warmed something deeper, as though reminding him that even hardship carried its rhythm. Dong! When the tolling ended, the silence it left behind felt heavier than the sound itself. The village seemed hushed, wrapped in the after echo. Only then did life stir again. Dogs barked faintly. A child called out to her mother. Smoke rose from hearths, carrying the scent of evening meals. Inside their hut, Kenji's mother had already lit a small lamp. Its glow spread softly against the paper walls, flickering with the movement of the flame. The family gathered around the hearth, where the day's meal simmered once more. A thin soup of greens and grain, stretched with care. They ate in near silence, the sound of rain tapping the roof their steady companion. When the bowls were emptied, his mother placed a bundle of cloth on the floor, unwrapping it to reveal a set of prayer beads, worn smooth from years of use. She took them in her hands, bowing her head as her lips moved in whispered recitation. Kenji watched quietly, his body swaying faintly with fatigue. His father remained seated, his eyes closed, his breathing deep. For a time, no words passed between them, only the rhythm of prayer and the sigh of wind beyond the walls. Later, when the lamp burned lower and shadows lengthened, Kenji asked softly, "Why does the bell sound every evening?" His father opened his eyes, considering. "It reminds us that the day ends," he said, "that no matter what burden we carry, it is laid down with the sun. Tomorrow will come, whether we are ready or not." His mother added gently, "And it reminds us we are small, Kenji. Small, but not forgotten." Kenji thought about this as he lay on his bedding, the thin blanket pulled to his chin. The bell had seemed vast, as though it belonged to the heavens themselves. Could it truly remember someone as small as him? Or was it only a reminder of how little he mattered? The rain softened into mist through the night, tapping faintly against the roof. Kenji's thoughts drifted with it, the image of the bell etched in his mind. Tall, bronze, unyielding, yet patient. He imagined it ringing again tomorrow, and the day after, and long after he was grown. Perhaps that was its lesson, that though lives bent and broke, the rhythm of the world endured. Would you find comfort in such a sound, if you lived then? Would the tolling at dusk soothe you, reminding you that burdens ended with the day? Or would it feel heavy, a reminder that your life was measured not in freedom, but in obedience to rhythms set long before your birth? The sandals rested by the door, drying slowly beside the fading fire. Beyond them, the world was dark, waiting for morning. And somewhere, high on the hill, the great bell waited too, ready to sound again when the sun fell once more. The fire had burned low during the night, its glow fading into a bed of grey ash. By morning, only a few red embers clung stubbornly at the heart of the hearth, like tiny eyes refusing to close. Kenji's mother knelt beside them, coaxing them gently back to life. She blew softly, her breath steady and patient, until the dull glow brightened. Then with practiced hands, she laid thin slivers of pine across the heat. They hissed faintly, then caught, sending up the first curls of smoke. The hut stirred with new warmth. Shadows stretched across the walls, shifting with the small flame as it grew. The scent of smoke mingled with the earthy aroma of damp wood and the faint sweetness of rice husks thrown into the fire. Kenji, still half drowsy on his bedding, watched the dance of light with heavy eyes. To him, it seemed a quiet miracle that something so small as a spark could warm an entire family against the cool weight of morning. He rose slowly, pulling his blanket aside, the straw beneath it crackling faintly. His father was already gone to the fields, his sandals leaving a faint trail of mud by the door. Kenji sat near the hearth, rubbing sleep from his eyes as his mother stirred the pot suspended above the flames. Today's meal was simple. Thin porridge once more, stretched with shredded greens and the last of a daikon root. Yet the smell of it filled the hut with a promise of strength. Kenji's mother ladled the steaming porridge into bowls, placing one before him. The clay was warm in his hands, the rising steam dampening his cheeks. He bent low, blowing gently across the surface before sipping. The taste was mild, almost bland, but there was comfort in its warmth, in the way it spread through his stomach like a slow ember. "Eat well," his mother said softly. "The fields will demand your strength today." Kenji nodded, though he did not speak. The sound of the fire and the scrape of wooden spoons filled the silence between them. Outside, the village was waking, roosters crowing, dogs barking, footsteps shuffling past. But here, for a brief time, the world was narrowed to 3 bowls of porridge, a low fire, and the whisper of steam curling upward into the rafters. When the meal was done, his mother sifted the ashes from the hearth, setting aside the largest coals to smoulder through the day. Ashes, she often said, were as precious as flame, for they carried yesterday's fire into tomorrow. She sprinkled a handful over the floor's damp patches, letting them soak up the moisture. Another pinch she scattered outside the door, a quiet offering to ward off unseen spirits. Kenji watched her with quiet fascination. He had always thought of ash as nothing more than what was left when the fire was gone. Yet in her hands, it was useful, protective, almost sacred. Later that evening, when they returned from the fields, the fire was once again the center of their world. Kenji crouched near it, his body aching from the day's work. His mother placed sweet potatoes, charred and blackened from the coals, into his hands. Their skins split easily beneath his fingers, releasing soft, steaming flesh that burned his tongue when he bit too eagerly. He winced, then laughed quietly, the warmth of food filling him with a joy deeper than words. His father, seated across from him, chewed more slowly, his face unreadable, but his posture softened by the firelight. His mother smiled faintly as she ate, her tired eyes reflecting the glow. For a time, no one spoke, yet the silence felt whole, filled with the crackle of wood, the sigh of flames, the smell of roasted roots. The hearth was not only a place of cooking, it was the heart of the home. Around it they ate, they mended, they whispered stories. Around it, they prayed in hushed tones when storms rattled the roof. Ash stained their hands, smoke clung to their clothes, yet without it, they would not endure the cold or the hunger. Kenji sometimes imagined that every fire in the village was connected, threads of smoke weaving together above the huts, carrying their warmth into the same sky. Perhaps that was why the air in the evenings always smelled of wood and rice, a single breath shared by every family. That night, as the fire settled low, his father added one last log, its bark wet from the rain. It hissed and smoked, filling the hut with a haze that stung Kenji's eyes. Yet, as the wood caught, the flames steadied once more. His father leaned back, his face softened by the glow, and said quietly, "Even fire must struggle to live." Kenji thought about that as he lay down to sleep, the last warmth of the hearth brushing his cheek. Ash clung faintly to his fingertips, a reminder of flame already gone, yet ready to return with breath and patience. Would you find comfort in such a fire? In a bowl of thin porridge, in a roasted root split with bare hands, in the quiet companionship of smoke and flame? Or would you ache for more, forgetting that even ash can carry tomorrow's warmth? The sandals rested by the door, dusted faintly with ash from the hearth. Beyond them, the night pressed close, but within, the fire endured. The rain had passed, leaving the village washed and glistening. Puddles shone like scattered mirrors along the road, reflecting fragments of sky. The air smelled of wet earth, rich and heavy, and every leaf along the trees by the paddies dripped with the remnants of the storm. Kenji walked barefoot, his sandals tied to his back so they could dry. Mud squeezed between his toes as he carried a bundle of firewood, collected with his mother from the edge of the forest. The weight pressed against his shoulders, but he did not complain. For on the path ahead walked a figure who made him forget his weariness. She was a girl of about his age, perhaps a little older, carrying a basket of greens. Her hair was tied in a simple knot, dark strands falling loose against her cheeks. Her face was calm, her gaze lowered to the path. But there was something about her presence that caught Kenji's eyes. Her name was Aiko. The villagers called her the Silent One. For though her lips moved when she was very young, a sickness had taken her voice. Since then, she had spoken only with her eyes, with the tilt of her head, with the quiet grace of her hands. Kenji remembered the first time he noticed her silence. He had been no more than 6, sitting near the well while the older children chased one another across the road. Aiko had been there too, watching, her small hands folded in her lap. When another child called her name, she opened her mouth, but no sound came, only a faint movement of lips, like the shadow of a word carried away before it was born. The others had laughed, but Kenji had only stared, curious and confused. Now, years later, he still watched her with that same quiet fascination. He wondered what it must feel like, to carry words inside, but never release them. Did her thoughts crowd her chest like birds trapped in a cage? Or did silence become its own language, one that others could not always hear? As they walked back toward the village, Aiko glanced at him. Her eyes were dark and steady, holding his gaze longer than most villagers ever dared. Then, almost imperceptibly, she smiled. It was not wide, not bright, but small and fleeting, like the glimpse of sun through heavy clouds. Kenji felt warmth rise to his face, though the air around them was cool. When they reached the village, she turned down a narrow lane, her basket balanced neatly against her hip. Kenji slowed, watching her figure disappear into the shadow of a hut. He stood still for a moment, his bundle heavy against his back, before turning toward his own home. That evening, as the family gathered around the hearth, Kenji asked softly, "Why can Aiko not speak?" His mother looked up from her mending, her expression gentle. "The gods wove her voice into silence when she was still a child," she said. "But silence does not make her less. It only makes her different." His father grunted softly, not unkindly. "Her hands are strong. She works as hard as any. That is what matters." Kenji thought of the smile she had given him, the way her eyes had held his without fear. He wondered if strength was not only in hands, but also in the quiet courage of meeting the world without a voice. The days that followed carried the usual rhythm: fields, fire, food, and fatigue. But Aiko lingered in Kenji's thoughts. He noticed her often at the well, drawing water with steady arms. He saw her carrying bundles of reeds, kneeling by her family's hearth, tending to her younger siblings. Always silent, yet always steady. Her presence spoke in ways words could not. Sometimes he imagined what her voice might sound like if it returned. Would it be soft, like the whisper of rain on leaves, or strong, like the tolling of the evening bell? One afternoon, as he worked near the edge of the paddies, Kenji saw her again. She was gathering herbs by the roadside, her hands moving quickly, skillfully. Without thinking, he walked closer, crouching a short distance away. She glanced up, then lowered her gaze, continuing her work. Kenji wanted to speak, but the words tangled on his tongue. At last, he said, "Do you need help?" She paused, then shook her head gently, a strand of hair falling across her cheek. With one hand, she tucked it back, her fingers delicate against her skin. Then, with the faintest movement, she reached into her basket and held out a sprig of green toward him. Kenji hesitated, then took it. The herbs smelled sharp, fresh, alive. He opened his mouth to thank her, but she had already returned to her gathering. It was a small exchange, wordless and brief, but to Kenji it felt larger than it seemed. That night, as he lay on his bedding, he thought of her again. He thought of the silence she carried, and the way it did not seem heavy to her, but rather like a cloak she had learned to wear. He wondered if he could ever wear such a cloak, if he could ever face a world where obedience demanded silence, not because of sickness, but because of law. Would you endure it? Could you live in a world where your voice, whether taken by illness or by rule, could not always be used? Would you find ways to speak with your hands, your eyes, your gestures, or would you break beneath the weight of unspoken words? The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its ashes glowing faintly in the dark. Kenji's eyes drifted shut, but the image of Aiko's smile remained, small, fleeting, and strong enough to outlast the silence. The summer sun pressed hard on the village, filling the air with a heavy stillness. Cicadas droned from the trees, their voices rising in waves, a chorus that seemed to stretch the hours into something longer than time itself. Kenji wiped sweat from his brow as he carried a bundle of reeds along the road, his bare feet raising little puffs of dust with every step. The road was busier than usual that day. Farmers led oxen heavy with plows, women balanced baskets of vegetables, and children darted between the huts. Yet despite the liveliness, An undercurrent of caution moved among them, as though everyone sensed the possibility of interruption. For in feudal Japan, interruption often came with danger. Kenji reached the well, setting down his bundle to rest. The stone rim was cool beneath his hands, the water within shimmering in the sun. Aiko was there too, drawing water with her usual quiet precision. She lifted the rope, arms flexing against the weight of the full bucket, her face calm beneath the effort. Their eyes met briefly, and Kenji offered her a small smile. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked down, dipping her ladle carefully into the bucket. It was then that the sound of hoofbeats broke the air. A horse approached, its stride steady, its rider tall and rigid in the saddle. A samurai. His armor was simple but well kept, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The villagers stilled at once, stepping aside, bowing low. A hush fell over the road, broken only by the rhythmic thud of hooves. Kenji bowed too, his forehead lowering toward the dust. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, heart pounding. Yet in the corner of his vision, he saw Aiko hesitate. Her bow was slower, her movement delayed by the heavy bucket she balanced. For the briefest instant, her gaze lifted, meeting the rider's eyes. The moment was no more than a flicker, but it was enough. The samurai reined in his horse, the animal snorting as it stamped against the earth. Silence deepened. Villagers held their breath, waiting. Kenji dared not look up, but he could feel the weight of the warrior's gaze settling on Aiko. "You," the man said, his voice low but sharp. The bucket wavered in Aiko's hands. She bowed deeply now, her head nearly touching the rim of the well. No words came from her lips, no apology, no plea, only silence. The samurai's silence stretched long, a pause filled with tension sharp as steel. Kenji's chest tightened. He wanted to step forward, to explain, to tell the warrior that she meant no disrespect, that her silence was not defiance but her nature. But his body refused to move. To speak out of turn would be to draw that sword upon himself. At last, the samurai gave a faint, dismissive snort. He flicked his reins, and the horse moved on, hooves striking the road in a steady rhythm once more. The villagers exhaled softly, shoulders relaxing, eyes lowering. The danger had passed, but not entirely. Kenji turned his head, just enough to see Aiko still bent low, her hands trembling slightly against the handle of the bucket. She remained bowed long after the horse had disappeared. When at last she straightened, her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. Without a word, she lifted the bucket and carried it away, her steps quick and careful, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Kenji watched her go, a weight pressing hard against his chest. The price of a glance, he thought. So small, so fleeting, and yet it had nearly cost her everything. That evening he told his mother what he had seen. She listened quietly, her hands busy mending a sleeve by the fire. When he finished, she shook her head slowly. "Eyes are dangerous, Kenji," she said softly. "They carry thoughts even when the mouth is silent. In this world, even a glance can be mistaken for pride, for defiance, and pride is punished." His father, seated by the hearth, added in his steady voice, "Remember this. Keep your eyes low. Respect is not only in your bow, but in your gaze. To forget is to invite ruin." Kenji nodded, but in his heart he wrestled with the thought. How could something as small as looking up be dangerous? How could silence itself be turned into defiance when all Aiko had done was lift her head? He thought of her hands trembling against the bucket, of the pale set of her face. He thought of the stories he had heard, whispered late at night, of men cut down for failing to bow quickly enough, of women beaten for speaking too boldly. The rules were not always spoken, yet they pressed heavier than chains. Over the days that followed, Kenji watched himself more carefully. He kept his eyes lowered when samurai passed, kept his face still even when he felt laughter bubbling in his chest. He noticed how others did the same, how villagers trained their very expressions to obedience. Smiles were small, restrained, words were careful, measured. Even joy had to bow. And yet, he could not forget Aiko's glance. He could not forget the strength it took for her to straighten afterward, to carry her bucket as though nothing had happened. In her silence, in her brief lifting of eyes, there had been something more than fear, something unspoken. Would you survive such a world, where even your glance must be weighed, measured, controlled? Where your eyes, your smile, your silence itself could be judged as rebellion? Or would you falter, forgetting the invisible rules that bound each gesture to survival? That night, as Kenji lay near the fire, he closed his eyes and practiced in the dark. He lowered his head, softened his face, slowed his breath. He imagined the weight of eyes upon him and trained himself not to flinch. Yet in the back of his mind, he remembered Aiko's fleeting gaze and wondered if sometimes the smallest glance could also be the bravest thing of all. The sandals by the door rested quietly, dust clinging to their edges. Tomorrow they would carry him back to the fields, back to the endless rhythm of bows and silences. But tonight, he dreamed of eyes that lifted, even when they were not meant to. At the edge of the village, where the last huts gave way to the reach of tall grasses and the first whisper of trees, stood a shrine. It was not large. No grand torii gate or towering lanterns. No stone guardians carved with fierce expressions. It was humble, scarcely taller than Kenji's shoulders. Its wood darkened by rain, its roof of thin shingles warped with age. And yet to the villagers, it was a place of great weight. Kenji often passed it on his way to gather firewood or reeds. Each time, his mother reminded him to bow, even if only briefly, even if no one else was watching. "The Kami see," she would say softly. "They hear even when we do not speak." The shrine itself was simple. A small wooden box set upon a stone base, its doors closed with a thin cord. Paper streamers hung from its eaves, fluttering faintly in the wind. Before it lay offerings, smooth pebbles, folded paper charms, sprigs of green, and sometimes a handful of rice when a family could spare it. Though meagre, each gift carried sincerity, for the villagers knew that their survival depended on more than their own hands. One morning, after the long work of the paddies, Kenji's mother took him there. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, which she held close to her chest as they walked. The air grew cooler beneath the trees, shadows shifting with the wind. Birds rustled in the branches, their calls sharp against the hush. When they reached the shrine, she knelt carefully, placing the bundle before the small wooden doors. She untied the cloth, revealing a simple offering, a bowl of rice, still warm, and a sprig of wildflowers gathered from the forest edge. She pressed her hands together, bowed her head, and whispered prayers Kenji could not fully hear. He knelt beside her, folding his hands as he had been taught. The earth was damp beneath his knees, cool against his skin. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened, not only to his mother's soft words, but to the sounds around them. The creak of branches, the sigh leaves, the faint trickle of water from a stream nearby. It seemed as though the world itself leaned close to listen. When she finished, his mother opened her eyes and looked at him. "Pray, Kenji," she said gently. "Not only for yourself, but for all of us. Kenji hesitated. What words could he offer to unseen ears? He thought of the fields, of the tax collector's ledger, of Aiko's trembling hands at the well. At last he whispered, "Please, keep us safe." His voice was small, almost swallowed by the wind, but his mother smiled faintly, as though the words carried more weight than he knew. On the walk back, she told him stories of the kami said to dwell there. Some believed it was a spirit of the forest, watching over the trees and streams. Others said it was a guardian of harvests, guiding the rice as it grew. Still others whispered that it was the spirit of an ancestor, lingering to protect the village. The truth did not matter. What mattered was that the shrine gave the villagers a place to hope, a place to lay their burdens where no tax collector could reach. That evening, Kenji thought of the shrine as he lay near the fire. He imagined the offerings resting quietly in the dark, the flowers wilting slowly, the rice cooling in its bowl. Did the spirit within eat, or did it simply listen? Did it care for their struggles, or was it as silent as the stars? The next day, he passed the shrine again, this time with Aiko nearby. She carried a bundle of sticks, her steps steady along the path. When she saw him pause before the shrine, she stopped too, setting her bundle down. She bowed low, her hands pressed together. Kenji followed her lead, though he wondered what prayers filled her silent chest. She lingered a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the fluttering streamers. Then, without a word, she bent to pick up a fallen pebble, smooth and grey, and placed it carefully at the shrine's base. Only then did she retrieve her bundle and continue walking. Kenji watched her go, struck by the quiet grace of the gesture. Perhaps that was what the shrine truly asked. Not grand gifts or elaborate words, but small acts of sincerity. As summer deepened, the shrine grew more adorned. Each passing villager added something: a folded scrap of paper, a stalk of green, a coin if fortune allowed. The ground before it became a patchwork of offerings, humble yet steadfast. It was as though the shrine absorbed not only gifts, but the hopes woven into them. Kenji's father rarely spoke of such things, yet even he paused sometimes to bow as they passed. "We work the fields," he said once, "but the harvest belongs to the heavens as much as to us. Would you believe it if you lived there? Would you kneel before a weathered wooden box, leaving your own meager food in hopes that unseen hands might protect your family? Would you find comfort in a prayer whispered into the wind? Or would you see only silence staring back?" For the villagers, the shrine was not an option. It was necessity. A world so heavy with rules, taxes, and the sharp edge of swords left little room for control. The shrine offered something else, the promise that not everything bowed to men, that some powers still lingered beyond reach. That night, when the bell tolled at dusk and the fire burned low, Kenji dreamed of the shrine again. He dreamed of paper streamers fluttering in a wind that carried no sound. He dreamed of flowers that never wilted, of rice that never cooled, of a spirit that listened patiently to every whisper. And when he woke, the memory of the dream clung to him like morning mist. He rose, tied his sandals, and followed the familiar road back toward the forest's edge, where ash, earth, and silence met beneath the wooden roof of the shrine. The rain returned in the middle of summer, heavier this time. For 3 days it fell, swelling the paddies until the ridges strained beneath the weight of water. The villagers worked tirelessly to patch leaks, to strengthen dikes with stones and reeds, to guard against the fields becoming rivers. Kenji waded through the mud with his father, the rain stinging his skin, the sky rumbling above them. By the fourth morning, the storm broke, leaving behind air heavy with dampness and paths slick with mud. The village breathed relief, though exhaustion clung to every back. It was on that day, when the air smelled of wet soil and smoke, that a stranger arrived. He was not samurai, nor tax collector, nor monk. His robe was travel-worn, patched in places, but tied neatly with a sash. Across his back, he carried a satchel of papers, their corners curled from damp. His straw hat dripped rainwater as he walked into the village, his sandals leaving deep marks in the softened road. The villagers watched cautiously from their doors. Travellers were rare, and each arrival carried uncertainty. Yet this man's presence seemed neither threatening nor proud. He moved with the patience of one who had walked far, his gaze soft though steady. At the well, he paused to draw water, nodding politely to the women who stared at him with wide eyes. Then, from his satchel, he drew a folded sheet of paper, wrapped carefully in cloth. He held it out, his voice calm. "A letter," he said, "for the family of Ito." The name stirred murmurs. The Ito family lived near the far edge of the village. Their eldest son conscripted seasons ago to serve the Lord's retinue. Kenji remembered the day the boy left, his parents bowing deeply, pride and fear warring in their eyes. Since then, they had spoken little of him, though his mother often knelt longer at the shrine. Her prayers whispered more fervently. The traveller carried the letter to their hut, where the Ito family gathered at the door. Their hands trembled as they received it, bowing again and again in gratitude. But when the traveller left, continuing down the road, a silence hung heavy over their home. For though they held the letter, none among them could read it. Word spread quickly. Neighbours came, whispering, glancing toward the Ito hut. A few suggested carrying the letter to the temple, where the monk might decipher it. Others shook their heads, wary of involving outside eyes in private words. That evening, Kenji sat by the hearth, listening as his parents spoke in low tones. "It is cruel," his mother said softly, "to hold words from a son, yet see only ink." His father poked the fire with a stick, his expression shadowed by the glow. "Cruel, yes, but it is the way of things. Letters belong to those with learning. For the rest of us, they are walls we cannot climb." Kenji thought of the folded paper resting in the Ito home, of the mother's hands clutching it to her chest, as though the strength of her embrace might reveal its meaning. He thought of the ink within, shapes and strokes that held a voice trapped beyond reach. Aiko passed him near the well the next day, her silent presence carrying more weight than words. In her basket, he saw a folded scrap of paper, worn and stained. She noticed his glance and held it up briefly before tucking it away again. Though she had no voice, she seemed to understand the hunger that lived in unspoken words. That night, Kenji asked his father, "Why do some learn to read and not others?" His father's sigh was long, heavy. "Because reading is power. Power belongs to those above. A farmer does not need words to bend over rice. A soldier does not need words to lift a spear. Words are for lords, monks, and merchants, not for us." Kenji lay awake long after, staring at the dark rafters above. He imagined the letter's lines, black strokes curling across pale paper. He imagined the Ito boy's hand pressing brush to ink, his thoughts taking form in shapes his own family could not read. To hold such a letter and never know its voice? Was it hope, or was it torment? The next morning, the monk came down from the temple. He carried himself with calm dignity, his robe dry despite the lingering damp in the air. The Ito family brought him the letter, their faces lined with both fear and longing. Kenji lingered at the edge of the crowd as the monk unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the strokes, his lips moving faintly as he read. At last, he lifted his head, his voice slow and steady. Your son writes that he is well. He serves faithfully. He prays for your health. He sends his respect. The Ito mother wept, clutching the letter against her chest. The father bowed deeply, gratitude spilling from him in murmurs. The crowd exhaled, some smiling, some wiping their eyes. Kenji felt warmth spread through him, yet also something else, an unease he could not name. For though the words comforted, he wondered, were they truly his? Or had the monk softened them, reshaped them, hidden truths too heavy to bear? Later, as he walked home, Kenji glanced once more at Aiko. She met his eyes, her hand resting briefly on the basket where her scrap of paper lay hidden. No words passed between them, but he felt the weight of silence again, the silence of letters unread, of voices carried away by ink. Would you endure it if you lived then, to know that your son, your brother, your husband had written, yet the meaning of his words was forever beyond your eyes? Would you trust the mouth that read them aloud, or would you wonder what truths the ink still kept hidden? That night, Kenji lay beside the hearth, the fire's glow flickering on the walls. He dreamed of letters drifting through the air like leaves, their strokes alive, their voices calling. But when he reached for them, they dissolved into smoke, leaving only silence. And still, in the Ito hut, the letter rested, its paper folded, its words locked away from the very hands that longed for them most. The castle on the hill loomed like a silent sentinel over the village. Its whitewashed walls gleamed faintly in the sun, its tiled roof rising tier upon tier against the sky. Kenji often looked up at it from the paddies, a place that seemed impossibly distant, belonging to another world. Yet within its walls, life unfolded with rhythms no less strict, no less heavy, than those that bound the villagers below. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter, carrying the faint scent of pine and incense. Tatami mats stretched across polished floors, their woven patterns soft beneath the feet of those permitted to walk upon them. Paper walls divided rooms, sliding smoothly on wooden tracks, their thinness both revealing and concealing. Sound travelled easily here. A whisper could pass through walls, yet heavy thoughts remained unspoken, trapped within the hearts of those who bore them. In one such room, a samurai sat cross-legged, his armour laid neatly before him. The plates gleamed with care, polished until they reflected the dim light of the lantern. His swords rested nearby, their scabbards dark, their hilts wrapped tight. He had removed them to sit in stillness, but their presence filled the room nonetheless, as though they breathed with their own weight. His name was Takeda Harunobu. To the villagers, he was little more than a shadow on horseback, a figure glimpsed briefly before dust swallowed his path. But within these paper walls, he was not only a warrior, he was a son, a husband, a father, and each of those roles pressed upon him like invisible armour heavier than steel. Across from him knelt his wife, her posture straight despite the fatigue in her eyes. She poured tea into a pair of cups, the steam rising between them like a faint veil. Her kimono, though simple, was immaculate, its folds precise. She spoke softly, her words carefully measured. "The messenger says your lord prepares for inspection." Takeda nodded, his gaze fixed on the armor before him. "It will be soon. I must be ready." She lowered her eyes, her hands tightening slightly around the teapot. She did not ask the questions that filled her heart, whether the inspection would mean departure, whether he would be called to fight, whether their children would wake one morning to find him gone. Those questions lived behind her lips, but never past them. In this house, as in the village, silence was often safer than speech. In the adjoining room, their children knelt before a low table, practicing calligraphy. A tutor guided their hands with calm patience, instructing them in the careful strokes of kanji. Ink pooled dark on white paper, each mark deliberate, disciplined. The children's brows furrowed with concentration, though their eyes sometimes drifted toward the sound of their parents' voices beyond the thin wall. For them, letters were not distant mysteries as they were to Kenji. They were lessons etched into their days, tools of command and heritage. Yet even here, where knowledge flowed more freely, the weight of expectation pressed heavily. To falter in calligraphy was not merely a child's mistake, it was a blemish upon the family's honor. Takeda's wife rose silently, carrying the teapot away. Alone now, he leaned forward, lifting his armor piece by piece. The breastplate was cool against his hands, the lacquered surface smooth, its weight reminding him of battles past and duties ahead. He traced the edge with his thumb, his reflection warped faintly in the curve. Honor. The word rang in his mind as solid as the toll of the temple bell. It was the measure of his life, the reason for his breath. Yet it was also a chain, binding him to paths he might not have chosen. Every gesture, every word, every silence was weighed against it. He thought of his father, now gone, who had once told him, "A samurai's heart is not his own. It belongs to his lord, to his family name, to the blade he carries. Only in death does he reclaim it." Takeda closed his eyes. He wondered, not for the first time, if peasants below the castle walls felt the same, if their silence and obedience, though born of hunger rather than honor, were not so different from his own. As night fell, lanterns glowed softly behind the paper walls, their light casting silhouettes that moved quietly through the rooms. His wife tucked their children into bedding laid neatly upon tatami, her voice low as she hummed a lullaby. The sound was fragile, almost tentative, as though afraid to disturb the silence around her. Takeda sat once more before his armor, sharpening his short blade with slow, careful strokes. The rasp of metal on stone filled the room, steady, unbroken. Beyond the walls, crickets sang in the summer air, their rhythm a counterpoint to the weight within. Would you endure such a life, if you lived then? To sit within paper walls, knowing that every word, every gesture, every silence shaped not only your own fate, but the honor of your bloodline. To polish armor, not only for battle, but for the gaze of lords who measured your worth in discipline and obedience. In the village below, peasants bent beneath taxes and toil. In the castle above, samurai bent beneath honor and legacy. Different burdens, yet burdens all the same. As Takeda set aside his blade, the lantern light flickered against the paper wall, casting his shadow tall and unyielding. But within his chest, his heart felt heavy, bound by silence, by duty, by the walls that both sheltered and confined him. And somewhere, beyond the castle, beyond the village, the great bell tolled once more, its voice rolling through the night, reminding both farmer and warrior alike that another day had ended, another would begin. The summer heat lingered long into the evening, even after the sun had dipped behind the hills. The air inside the hut was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of sweat and smoke. Kenji's hands ached from the day's work. The skin along his palms cracked and raw from pulling reeds and mending dikes. He rubbed them gently against the rough cloth of his trousers, but the sting remained. Beside the hearth, his mother ladled out bowls of porridge thinned with barley. The fire glowed low, its embers crackling faintly, filling the room with the soft rhythm of flame. His father sat cross-legged, sharpening a sickle with slow, steady movements, his silhouette outlined by the glow. Aiko had come too, her quiet figure helping Kenji's mother wash the bowls and stir the pot. Her silence fit naturally into the rhythm of the home, as if she had always belonged there. When the bowls were emptied and the tools set aside, the family lingered by the fire, too tired to sleep, but too weary to speak much. The night pressed close around the thin walls, insects buzzing beyond the paper door. It was then, as so often happened in the long hours after work, that the stories began. Kenji's mother was the first to speak, her voice low and steady, carrying the cadence of words repeated many times before. Long ago, they say, there was a fox who walked as a man, she began, her hands folded neatly in her lap. He wore the shape of a traveller, his face kind, his bow polite, but his eyes gleamed too bright, and his shadow walked a step behind him. Those who welcomed him into their homes found their food gone, their strength drained, their lives twisted into misfortune. Kenji leaned closer, his eyes reflecting the firelight. How could they know he was a fox? His mother smiled faintly. They say if you looked closely, his tail would flick beneath his robe, but not everyone dared to look. Aiko's eyes widened at the tail, her hands stilling where she had been folding cloth. She pressed her lips together, as though holding back words she could never release. Kenji's father snorted softly. Fox or man, trouble comes when you invite strangers. Better to keep one's doors closed at night. But his mother continued, her voice taking on a softer tone. Not all foxes brought harm. Some stories tell of fox spirits who guided lost travelers, who guarded shrines, who fell in love with those who showed them kindness. The world is full of spirits, some cruel, some kind. We must be careful, but never without hope. The fire crackled, filling the pause that followed. Kenji's hands, though sore, felt lighter as he listened. For in these stories, the hardships of fields and taxes gave way to something larger, worlds where animals spoke, where gods walked among men, where justice came not from lords, but from spirits unseen. Another night, his father told a different kind of story, one of ghosts. They say the restless dead wander the roads at night, he began, his voice low, his eyes half hidden in shadow. Men who died with anger in their hearts, cut down before their time, their spirits linger still. They appear as pale figures, their eyes empty, their feet never touching the ground. Those who see them feel the air grow cold, their breath stolen from their chest. Kenji shivered, glancing toward the paper door that trembled faintly in the wind. What do they want? He asked. His father's gaze was steady. Peace, but they cannot find it, not until the wrongs of their lives are set right. That is why we bow at shrines, why we honor our ancestors. To leave a spirit restless is to invite it into your dreams. Kenji swallowed hard, pulling his blanket closer around his shoulders. Aiko's hands tightened in her lap, her eyes flicking toward the shadows along the walls. For a moment, the crackle of the fire seemed louder, the night outside deeper. Yet the fear was not crushing, it was shared. And in that sharing, there was comfort. To sit together, to whisper tales of foxes and ghosts, was to remind themselves that their struggles were not only of rice and taxes, but part of something larger, mysterious, and unseen. Sometimes the stories carried lessons too. His mother told of a farmer who grew greedy, hiding grain meant for his neighbours. The kami of the fields grew angry, and his harvest withered while others thrived. Another time, his father told of a boy who dared to laugh at a monk, mocking his prayers. That night, the boy dreamed of fire consuming his home, and when he woke, his hut was nothing but ash. Kenji listened, his young heart tugged between fear and wonder. Each story wrapped around him like the smoke from the fire, sometimes choking, sometimes comforting, always lingering long after the flames had died down. Would you find solace in such tales if you lived then? Would you huddle close to the fire, listening with wide eyes as ghosts and foxes walked through your imagination? Or would you feel the stories too heavy, too frightening, in a world already full of burdens? For Kenji, the stories were both burden and blessing. They reminded him of dangers unseen, of rules deeper than those of lords and samurai. But they also gave him hope, that even cracked hands and weary hearts were part of a larger world where spirits watched, where wrongs could be righted, where silence itself could carry meaning. That night, as the fire sank into embers, Kenji drifted toward sleep. His palms still ached, his body still weary. But in his dreams, foxes darted through the paddies, their eyes bright and mischievous. Ghosts walked the roads, but they bowed kindly as they passed. And the stories lingered, wrapping him in the warmth of a world larger than the narrow path of sandals and soil. The hearth whispered low, scattering ash across the floor, and in the silence of night, the cracked hands of the villagers rested at last, comforted by the echo of ghost stories whispered in the dark. The day began in stillness, too still for summer. The air lay heavy across the paddies, pressing down like a weight. Not a single leaf stirred, not a single bird sang. Even the cicadas, so constant in their chorus, fell silent. Kenji noticed it first as he walked barefoot along the ridge, the mud drying and cracking beneath his toes. The silence made him uneasy, though he could not say why. His father noticed too. He stood at the edge of the fields, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Far to the south, the sky darkened, thick clouds gathering like an army on the march. "Storm," he muttered, his voice low, his jaw tight. The villagers moved quickly. Women rushed to tie down thatched roofs with ropes, their hands moving with urgent precision. Men reinforced dikes with stones, their backs straining under the weight. Children carried buckets of water and bundles of reeds, their laughter absent, replaced with wide, worried eyes. Even the dogs seemed restless, pacing along the road with tails lowered. By afternoon, the first gusts came. The trees bent beneath invisible hands, their branches rattling against one another. Dust swirled across the path, stinging Kenji's eyes. He clutched a bundle of reeds tighter against his chest as his father shouted, "Faster!" The paddies shimmered with unease, their mirrored surfaces rippling in the rising wind. By evening, the storm arrived. It came first with rain, thick, unrelenting sheets that hammered the roofs and turned the roads into rivers of mud. Water spilled over the ridges, flooding the paddies in torrents that threatened to uproot the rice. Kenji and his father worked in the downpour, their bodies soaked, their hands raw from shoving stones into place. The sky cracked with lightning, bright as day, followed by thunder that shook the very earth. The hut groaned beneath the weight of the wind. His mother pressed cloth along the seams of the door, whispering prayers between each motion. Aiko crouched near the hearth, her silent lips moving as though forming words that could not break free. The fire sputtered, smoke filling the room, but still they fed it, unwilling to let the only warmth die. Kenji's arms trembled with exhaustion as he dragged another bundle of reeds to the dike. His father's voice cut through the rain, sharp and urgent. "Hold it steady!" Together, they jammed the reeds into a breach, water gushing past them with a force that threatened to sweep them away. The mud beneath their feet shifted, sucking at their sandals. And then, with a terrible crack, one of the dikes broke. A rush of water surged into the fields, sweeping away young stalks, filling the paddy until it overflowed. Kenji stumbled, nearly falling, but his father grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. They fought to redirect the flow, their bodies pressed against the current. But the storm was merciless. By the time they staggered back to the hut, the village was half drowned. Roofs sagged beneath the weight of rain, doors rattled against their frames. Families huddled inside, whispering prayers, clutching one another as the wind screamed like 1,000 voices outside. The night stretched long, endless. The thunder rolled again and again, each strike rattling the walls. The rain seeped through the roof in steady drips, pooling on the floor. Kenji lay awake on his bedding, his body aching, his mind racing with fear. He could hear his mother's prayers, his father's steady breath as he sat guard near the door, Aiko's silent rocking beside the fire. At some point, exhaustion dragged him into sleep. He dreamed of water rising, swallowing the village, carrying away sandals, huts, even the shrine at the forest's edge. He dreamed of foxes swimming through the flood, their eyes gleaming, of ghostly figures drifting above the waves. When he woke, the storm still raged, and his heart pounded as though the dream had followed him into waking. Toward dawn, the wind began to ease. The rain softened, turning from sheets into steady drops. The thunder moved farther away, its growl faint against the fading night. Slowly, painfully, the storm passed, leaving behind a silence heavier than its roar. When the villagers emerged, the world had changed. The paddies lay torn, their ridges broken, water spilling freely across them. Crops lay flattened, their delicate stalks tangled and broken. Huts sagged beneath missing patches of thatch, their walls streaked with mud. The shrine at the forest's edge had lost its streamers, their white paper scattered among the trees like fallen feathers. Kenji walked barefoot through the mud, his body sore, his heart heavy. Around him, neighbors moved in silence, their faces pale with exhaustion. A woman wept quietly as she scooped water from her hut. A man cursed softly under his breath, though his voice broke with despair. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed and trembling. Yet amid the ruin, the villagers did not collapse. Slowly, steadily, they began to work. Men lifted fallen beams. Women swept mud from the floors. Children gathered reeds to patch the dikes again. Kenji's father straightened his back, his face hard, but determined. "The rice still stands," he said, pointing toward the paddies, where some shoots, though bent, still rose above the water. "We begin again." Kenji looked at those fragile stalks, battered yet unbroken. They seemed impossibly small against the destruction, yet they endured. Would you endure it, if you lived then? To see a night storm undo months of labour, to wake to ruin and yet rise again, bending your back once more to the soil? Would you find strength in the fragile shoots that still stood? Or would despair press too heavy upon you? The sandals by the door were caked with mud, their straw darkened by the flood. Yet they waited, as they always did, ready to carry their weight into another day. The morning after the storm, the world felt bruised. The sky was pale and washed out, as though even the heavens had grown weary from the night's violence. The air smelled of wet earth, of reeds torn from the riverbanks, of smoke rising from dampened fires. Everywhere Kenji looked, he saw the marks of ruin, broken ridges in the paddies, roofs sagging under missing thatch, paths churned into thick rivers of mud. Yet he also saw movement. The villagers, their bodies aching, had risen with the dawn. Men hauled stones to repair the dikes, women spread reeds to dry, children gathered driftwood carried in by the swollen streams. No one spoke loudly. The air was too heavy for that. But in their quiet persistence, there was a rhythm as steady as the toll of a bell. Kenji's own hands were raw, the skin split from hauling reeds through the storm. His palms stung as he carried a bundle of wet straw to the edge of the paddies. His father worked beside him, shoulders bent, jaw set, his movements slow but unyielding. Together they pressed new reeds into the mud, sealing gaps where water had spilled freely only hours before. At midday, they returned to the hut. Inside, the air was damp, the roof dripping faintly in one corner. The hearth smouldered, its embers coaxed to life once more by Kenji's mother. She stirred a thin porridge, her face pale but calm. The pot smelled faintly of barley and greens salvaged from the storm. She ladled the food into 3 bowls, setting them carefully on the floor. Kenji's father ate quickly, his hunger sharp from the morning's labor. Kenji followed, though each bite reminded him how thin the porridge had become. There was less rice, less barley, less of everything. The storm had taken more than roofs and dikes. It had taken food meant to last through the season. Kenji finished his bowl and set it aside, his stomach still hollow. His mother noticed, though she said nothing. Later, he saw her hide her own portion beneath a cloth, saving it for him when she thought no one would see. That evening, the village gathered near the well. Families carried what little they had salvaged: baskets of rice, bundles of millet, roots pulled from flooded fields. The headman stood on the raised step of a hut, his robe still damp, his face lined with exhaustion. "We must share what we have," he said, his voice rough but steady. "The storm has left us with less, but if we divide carefully, no one will starve." The villagers murmured their assent, though their eyes betrayed their fear. Hunger was no stranger to them, yet in the shadow of the storm it loomed larger, sharper, more dangerous. Kenji stood beside his mother as she placed their small bundle of rice into the pile. The grain seemed pitiful among the other offerings, yet she bowed low as she set it down, her hands trembling slightly. When she straightened, she caught Kenji's gaze, her eyes soft but determined. Later, as the headman measured out portions, Kenji saw something that burned itself into his memory. A woman from the far side of the village approached the pile. Her face was gaunt, her kimono patched so many times it seemed more thread than cloth. At her side clung a child no older than 5, his cheeks hollow, his eyes wide. When their turn came, the headman placed a small bundle of rice into the woman's hands. She bowed deeply, clutching it as though it were treasure. But as she turned away, another villager stepped forward, a man known for his sharp tongue and sharper greed. He looked at her bundle, then at his own, and scowled. "Why does she receive as much as I?" he demanded. "Her husband gives nothing to the dikes. My back breaks for this village, and yet she takes what I earn." The woman froze, her child pressing closer against her leg. The headman's face tightened, but before he could speak, Kenji's mother stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but firm. She receives because she has a child who hungers. The storm does not spare the small. The man's eyes flashed, his mouth opening for retort. But then, from somewhere behind him, another voice spoke, a voice deeper, steadier. Kenji's father. "Enough," he said simply. His gaze was hard, unflinching, and the man fell silent. Slowly, grudgingly, he stepped back. The woman bowed low, tears in her eyes, then hurried away with her child. Kenji watched her go, the bundle of rice clutched tightly in her hands. He thought of the thin porridge at home, of his own empty stomach, and yet he felt no bitterness. Instead, he felt something like warmth, fragile, fleeting, but real. That night, as they sat by the hearth, Kenji's mother said softly, "Mercy is heavier than rice. It feeds more than the body." Her words lingered with him long after he lay down to sleep. The days that followed were hard. Work stretched from dawn until night. Every hand needed to repair what the storm had broken. The food shared at the well grew thinner, the portions smaller. Yet amid the hunger, small acts of kindness flickered like sparks in the dark. Kenji saw an old man pass half his portion to a neighbor's child, his hands trembling but his eyes calm. He saw a girl slip a sweet potato into Aiko's basket, her gesture hidden beneath lowered lashes. He saw his own mother rise before dawn to prepare a bowl of porridge, then carry it quietly to the widow at the edge of the village, leaving it at her door without a word. And in return, kindness came back. One evening, after Kenji had worked until his arms shook with exhaustion, a neighbor brought them a bundle of greens, salvaged from the flooded fields. "Too bitter for me," the woman said with a shrug, though her smile betrayed the lie. Kenji's mother bowed deeply, her eyes glistening. For Kenji, these moments became lifelines. A bowl of porridge, a smile shared at the well, a reed offered for the dikes. Each act of mercy seemed small, almost invisible. Yet together, they wove a net strong enough to hold the village through hunger and ruin. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Kenji turned to his father. Why do they give when they have so little themselves? His father's eyes reflected the glow of the hearth. He was silent for a long time, sharpening his sickle with slow, deliberate strokes. At last he said, "Because if they do not, none of us will endure. Alone, a man dies. Together, we survive." Kenji thought of this as he drifted into sleep, the thin blanket pulled around his shoulders. He thought of the woman with her child, of the old man's trembling hands, of the smile that had passed between neighbors at the well. He thought of how hunger pressed down like a storm, and yet kindness rose against it, small but unyielding. Would you find such strength if you lived then? Would you share the last of your rice, knowing your own belly would ache? Would you give a smile when your heart was heavy, a moment of mercy when the world offered none? The sandals by the door were patched with new straw, their edges frayed but still holding. Tomorrow they would carry Kenji once more into the mud, into the fields, into the endless rhythm of labor. But tonight they rested beside the hearth, dusted faintly with ash, waiting in silence. And in that silence, mercy lingered still. A bowl, a smile, a moment that carried more weight than the storm itself. The sun slipped lower across the horizon, casting long shadows over the village. The sky softened into hues of gold and rose, the heavy grey of recent storms fading into a calm evening glow. The paddies shimmered with reflected light, their surfaces still rippling faintly from the work of the day. Birds wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the quiet. Kenji walked slowly along the ridge, his sandals caked with dried mud. His body ached from the hours of labour, but his steps were steady. At his side, his father carried a bundle of reeds, and behind them, his mother walked with a basket of greens. Aiko trailed a few steps farther back, her face calm, her silence as natural as the wind itself. Together they moved toward home, their figures framed by the fading light. The village lay ahead, its huts softened by the glow of dusk. Thin trails of smoke rose from the hearths, carrying the scent of cooking fires. Children's laughter drifted faintly on the breeze, mingling with the creak of cartwheels and the low murmur of voices. Despite hunger, despite ruin, despite the endless weight of rules and storms, life carried forward. When they reached the hut, Kenji's mother lit the lamp, its glow spreading across the paper walls. The hearth was coaxed to flame once more, its warmth filling the room. Bowls were set out, thin porridge ladled, roots sliced and stirred. They ate together in silence, the crackle of fire and the sigh of the wind their only companions. Kenji's father sat back, his face softened by the glow. His mother folded her hands in her lap, her eyes tired but gentle. Aiko sipped quietly from her bowl, her gaze steady on the flames. For a moment, the world outside, the castle, the taxes, the storm, the unseen rules, seemed far away. After the meal, Kenji slipped outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. He looked toward the forest's edge, where the shrine stood. Its paper streamers had been replaced, fresh and white, fluttering gently in the evening breeze. Someone had left a small offering of rice, its grains glistening faintly in the fading light. Kenji bowed low, whispering a prayer he barely understood. Not for wealth, not for power, only for another day. The bell tolled once more from the temple on the hill, its deep voice rolling across the fields. Kenji closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. It carried with it the memory of every moment, the weight of straw sandals, the ache of cracked hands, the mercy of shared bowls, the whispers of ghost stories. It was a reminder that life was not measured in great victories, but in small continuities, day after day, breath after breath. When he returned to the hut, his parents had already begun their nightly tasks. His father sharpened his blade, the steady rasp filling the room. His mother mended a sleeve by the fire, her fingers deft despite their weariness. Aiko sat quietly, folding cloth with careful precision. Kenji lay on his bedding, the straw rustling beneath him, and watched the lamplight flicker across the walls. He thought of the samurai he had seen on the road, their armor gleaming, their eyes sharp. He thought of the tax collector's ledger, its ink heavy as hunger. He thought of the storm that had torn through their fields, and of the fragile shoots that still rose, bent but unbroken. He thought of Aiko's silence, her gaze steady, her smile fleeting but real. Would you survive such a world, he wondered? Would you endure the sandals biting into your feet, the porridge stretched thin, the silence pressed upon every glance and gesture? Would you rise again after storms, sharing what little you had, finding mercy where the world gave none? For Kenji, there was no choice but endurance. Life was not a matter of lasting a single day, but of lasting one day after another, each one heavy with rules, yet also threaded with moments of kindness. The fire sank lower, its glow softening into embers. His father set aside the blade. his mother folded her cloth. Aiko lay down near the hearth, her face peaceful in sleep. Kenji closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of their breaths, the steady sigh of wind against the walls, the faint rustle of night beyond. And then the day was gone. The Sandals rested by the door, their straw frayed but still strong. Tomorrow they would carry him once more into the mud, into the fields, into the silence of obedience and the resilience of labor. Tomorrow would be no easier, no kinder, yet tomorrow would come. For such was life in feudal Japan, harsh, unyielding, yet enduring. Would you have lasted a day? Perhaps not. But the villagers did, not only one day, but many, rising each morning with cracked hands, bowed heads, and hearts that still carried whispers of hope. And as sleep pulled Kenji into its quiet embrace, the world softened around him. The fire's warmth lingered, the night grew still, and the Sandals by the door waited patiently for dawn. Outro, gentle bedtime close. So let the day fade quietly, as it always did in that distant world. Let the Sandals rest by the door, let the fire sink into embers. Let the whispers of feudal Japan carry you into dreams. Sleep well, wherever you are. May tomorrow rise gently for you, as it once did for them.